Up next, though, we're going to talk with Judith Miller. Here's the book, the story. You know what this is about. She'll be here in just a minute, but recently we covered on Book TV an event with Ms. Miller. We want to show you part of that before she joins us here on our set.
I mean, what was striking to me was that when I went back and I interviewed English intelligence, British intelligence, and Israeli intelligence, and some German intelligence, is whether or not you wanted to go to war, whether or not their country's policymakers wanted to go to war, they were not deeply divided about the presumed existence of WMD in Iraq. What they disagreed about was whether or not that was sufficient cause to go to war. And people of goodwill could disagree about the second part without challenging necessarily the first. I mean, I think that there's a lot of rewriting of history about what Americans were actually told. Before the McClatchy papers wrote a very good article on aluminum tubes, Americans already knew that the tubes, that there was an intense debate within the intelligence community about the tubes. And they knew that not from McClatchy, but from Michael Gordon and me in the New York Times. Because 5 days after, Michael and I wrote the story about aluminum tubes, we learned about the debate. And we wrote that story and put it in the New York Times. And yes, I would have liked that story to have been on the front page, but it wasn't. So, you know, I think it's, I know if you're involved in the debate at the time, you feel strongly, and you might have felt pressure, but all people like me had to go on were what we could get at that moment, and then subsequently the findings of these different panels that, you know, getting it wrong was just as bad.
Well, like the famous case involving Curveball.
Yeah.
The source and the German intelligence were saying, don't trust this guy. It's not...
not all the German intelligence. That's my case. They were not all saying that. And I'm not going to drag all the rest of you through something boring and painful. But that is not accurate at all.
Also, you know, once again, people have different memories. Tyler Drumheller, who was an analyst, said that he was...
Tyler Drumheller was not an analyst.
Right.
I think it's important that if you should write an article or something about the classified part that we haven't. You've written about the classified information. So you said there was only an unclassified report. Where's your article about the classified information? Okay, I'd love to see it because I haven't seen it. Now, I did not report on mobile biological labs until we actually, the XTF, which was the group in which I was embedded in Iraq, came across one of those labs, which turned out to be for rockets, balloons. But they were convinced, the analysts that I talked to, and I was there reporting on them as they were doing the measurements and taking the measurements, were convinced that these labs were for biological production. And Bill Broad and I wrote the first story about that, and then the CIA issued a white paper saying that. We wrote that and put it on the front page. And then I went back to Iraq in June to talk to people, one of whom is now dead, so I can name him. He was still in Britain, is David Kelly, the British biological analyst, who told me, was one of the people who told me, the CIA's got it wrong. And David Kay, who led the weapons hunt and went on NBC and said, this is a biological lab, as sure as I'm standing here, he got it wrong. And he didn't lie, he got it wrong. And so we then did a third article that said, these labs actually appear to be for weather balloons, for rocketry. This stuff Look, what I wrote this book so that I could talk about mistakes I made. I think it's really important to look at mistakes we make, the intelligence community makes, so we can understand how to make them, not make them again. But when you stop doing that, when you stop going back and asking the questions, that's when you fall into convenient patterns of thought that fit your ideological, preference or something you want to believe.
And that was a recent appearance by Judith Miller, formerly of the New York Times, talking about her new book, The Story, A Reporter's Journey. And Ms. Miller now joins us here in Miami. Judith Miller, this is a complicated story. In your book, you lay out, in a sense, an outline in the first couple of pages to let everybody know, here's where it begins, here's where it ends, and then you explain the in-between. How long have you been covering the Middle East?
Since 1971, when I was a student. I went to Jerusalem, fell in love with the Middle East, decided I had to learn more about it, went as a student to Egypt, Jordan, etc., and it was instant. It was out of my childhood Bible class. There it was. And of course, being new to the Middle East, I thought, Arab-Israeli conflict? This isn't so hard to settle. Each person gives a little and we divide Jerusalem and no problem here. American naivete, but I kept going back and learning how complicated it was, and now I have fewer solutions and only more questions.
What was your life like in 2002?
2002. Well, it was
You were flying pretty high in
hard.
a sense, weren't
No,
you?
I was in deep mourning. I had watched the trade towers come down. I live downtown. I live right near there. I had seen my friends pushed out of their homes. We had all in New York lost people and friends. And I kept saying and asking myself, if only we'd done our series sooner, if only we'd written about Al-Qaeda and the threat sooner. I was filled with remorse about everything we hadn't done, even though I was winning the Pulitzer for what we had done. Co-sharing it with the enormous, fantastic team. But it was such a frantic period. I didn't have time to think or really to grieve or to mourn. We were just busy trying to figure out who did this, why did they do it, who was to blame, how do we fix what went wrong. That's what I was doing in 2002.
All right. Let's move it forward since we don't have much time with you, and we do want to work in calls and text messages as well before you have to leave. What did you write? What happened? Where's Scooter Libby involved in this?
Right.
And why did you go to jail?
Well, I went to jail to protect a source, Scooter Libby, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, for a story I never wrote about a conversation it turned out we hadn't had. The reason I wrote this book is that I was pilloried for having gotten things wrong that I really think I didn't get wrong. The intelligence was wrong, and that's not a cop-out because I made my share of mistakes. But I was also praised for doing something that it turned out was not so good, which was to give testimony that turned out to be wrong. And Peter, if I have a regret, and the reason I wrote this story is that I wrote a story to say, journalism's complicated, we're always going to get things wrong, but the real sin in our profession is not going back to look at what you did wrong and try and get it right. And that's what I've done in this book. I wanted to tell the story of Scooter Libby and how I confused an interview I had with someone else. Why I went to jail not because I'm courageous, I'm not, but because I felt I had no choice. No one would talk to a journalist if we didn't honor our pledges to protect the people who cooperate and inform the American people, tell them things the government doesn't want them to know. So that wasn't courageous. What was courageous was figuring out that I'd made a terrible mistake that had been unfair to Mr. Libby and I had to go back and correct it and look at the whole process of journalism, what's happened to us, what happened to WMD, adventures along the way. And it was the most difficult book I've ever written. I hope it's a fun book, but in parts, but I'm not used to writing I, we, me. I'm much more comfortable writing about you, or writing about other people. This was tough.
Today, sitting here in 2015, in your personal view, was the invasion of Iraq a good thing?
I know, it turned out to be a disaster. But the decision to invade, I think, is more complicated. And that's what I try and look at. Let's look back. After 9/11, if you were president of the United States, Republican or Democrat, and you had been told by your intelligence agencies with high confidence, all 16 of them, that they believed WMD was still being hidden away by Saddam, a man who had gassed his own people, broken every UN pledge he had made, violated 17 resolutions, killed the Kurds in a genocidal fashion, and conducted terrorism against Westerners, invaded his neighbor. Would you take the chance that that material would be passed along to enemies of the United States? I don't fault George Bush for the decision he made. I fault George Bush for the way in which he conducted the war, and then I congratulate him for the equally tough and surprising decision he made to do the surge when all of his advisors, or most of them, were opposed to it. He did it. He thought it was the right thing to do. It turned out to stabilize the country. We can argue about the rest.
Judith Miller is our guest. You've all heard the story. We are going to start with a call from Marjorie in Pratt, West Virginia. Marjorie, you're on the air. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call. One of the things, Ms. Miller, and I've watched you be interviewed a few times on C-SPAN, and you don't seem to think that you were manipulated by Dick Cheney, and many of us out here do believe that you were manipulated. And the reason I believe you were manipulated was the timing of your article in the paper and how it seemed to be so well coordinated with Condoleezza Rice, Dick Cheney, and others appearing on the Sunday morning news talk shows at the same time. So my question is this. When you have an opportunity to do a future story about our going to war, have you thought about what you would do in order to avoid the kind of controversy you found yourself in? Because I do believe that you had so much credibility that you're seeming to get manipulated. Really, honestly, it hurt me that I trusted so much in your credibility.
Well, Marjorie, it's a really good question, but let me just tell you, I have not met George Bush to this day, and I did not even meet Dick Cheney until after he left office, years after he left office. He gave me an interview. The people who gave me this information did not give it to me. Michael Gordon and I, and the two of us wrote that very controversial story about aluminum tubes. We had to pull it out of people. We had to stitch this story together and confront the administration with what we knew. And only after we did that did they agree to talk about what they considered a top secret program that the administration didn't want to talk to us about. I think from their standpoint, once they realized we had the story, they were going to spin it and make the best of it. But what I wanted to do in this book was to tell people how that story came about so you understand more about my business and how we do it. Are you going to be used, and was what you write going to be used? Yes. And I'm sorry if it raised questions in a lot of people's minds about my intentions, but my intentions was simply and Michael Gordon's, and by the way, most of my stories were written with other people at the Times. We wanted to tell the American people what the president was reading and hearing that was guiding his decision on war or not war. And but yes, did they spin it and use it once we wrote that story? Yes, they did. So I understand why you feel the way you do, and thank you for asking the question.
This is a text message from area code 205. Was Dick Cheney dishonest about weapons of mass destruction? Yes or no?
Oh, I'm not sure you can do a yes or no question. I think he put the worst possible spin on the information he had, but the information he was getting was just really terrifying. You know, I covered Dick Cheney before when he was Secretary of Defense, and before also his health problems and his heart attacks, and I think 9/11, he writes about this in his own book, and we talked about it afterwards. 9/11 was a shock to him, a real shock to the system, and he was absolutely determined that the next 9/11 was not going to be one with WMD, and he was determined to go to war. So did he spin the information in the hardest way possible? Yes, he did. Was he lying? I think that's a question he has to answer. I only know that I didn't get the information from him. I got it from the men and women who had never lied to me. They were the wonks, the analysts who were actually doing the assessments, and they more than any people feel a sense of sadness and tragedy about what happened.
Yeah, and here is the book. Phil in Northport, Florida. You are on the air with Judith Miller.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. I have a couple of questions. During the 1980s war between Iraq and Iran, did not Saddam Hussein use limited chemical weapons against Iran, to killing thousands of them? And if you go back a few years earlier than that, didn't the Israeli Air Force fly that great mission and take out a nuclear development site right outside of Baghdad? And did anyone ever check Syria?
Yes.
For the weapons of mass? Did Saddam Hussein possibly take them over the border into Syria? Who then didn't Assad use them recently? Is this all possible? And if you're the president of the United States,
all right, that's a lot,
that's
Phil.
That's a lot of questions.
Phil, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Judith Miller.
Let me just say, absolutely, the Israelis did bomb Osirak, which was the Iraqi nuclear facility, and they destroyed it, and in so doing, they destroyed the nuclear program, really, which was never able to get up and running again, though Saddam tried. And yes, the reason I felt so strongly about WMD in Iraq is that I had covered the genocide against the Kurds, the use by Saddam of chemical weapons against his own people in Halabja. I had stood on the side of a mass grave and watched bodies be unearthed, women, children, frozen after a sarin gas and VX gas attack. That's at least what we thought it was. I knew he was willing to use this material and wouldn't hesitate to use it against us if he had the opportunity. So there was every reason for a president to believe that he had WMD and was willing to use it. As for Syria, Charles Delfer, who was wrote an extraordinarily good report, the kind of definitive report on what happened to the WMD, says that the reports on Syria, that chemical and some biological weapons had been shipped to Syria, he leaves that as an open question. He was never actually able to verify it one way or another. But this I will say, readers of the New York Times learned in September of 2014 that Iraqis and American soldiers were being sickened by chemical weapons that they were still encountering from the age-old program that Saddam had either forgotten about or didn't know where they were hidden or continued lying about. So, this WMD story is very, very complicated, and I'm sure 10 years from now we're still going to be asking questions about it. Surely I am.
And finally, Chris from Silver Spring, Maryland sends in this text. Do former Ba'athist Iraqi and Syrian military officers combining with Sunni elements comprise the ISIS leadership today?
Absolutely true, and Joby Warwick, whom we've just had on this show, is his book. I'm looking forward to reading it. ISIS is the son of Al-Qaeda, and it is lethal, especially lethal because it has Saddam's intelligence operatives, his generals, his interior security people, advising them, organizing them, running their finance. This is an extraordinarily serious group, a group that does not hesitate to crucify Christians and those who disagree with them, behead people, and even worse than that, put on camera what they do. They boast about it as a recruiting vehicle. I don't know a lot about true evil, but I do know that they're it, and that that has to be stopped. And stopping them from getting their hands on chemical and biological weapons and weapons of mass destruction is surely a fight that I think we have to make as a country and as members of, hopefully, a civilized world.
The story, A Reporter's Journey by Judith Miller, praised in both the New York Times Book Review and by the New Yorker, published by Simon & Schuster. Well, Book TV now continues here from Miami, where the next panel that we're going to be covering up in the Chapman Hall.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.